So the pros of new build property. This is a question that we're getting a lot at the moment. I think there's a number of different pros for new build property. The first is energy efficiency. New builds tend to be a little bit smaller in terms of average size and much better insulated than older homes. You could save anywhere between sort of £600-700 on heating every year by buying a new home or building a new home than you may be able to save on an older property. Next one is modernity. I think new builds are typically more modern. They tend to appeal very strongly to younger buyers, very popular with young professionals. Many include smart home features, rapid connectivity in terms of broadband, Wi-Fi, attractive open plan layouts. With apartment buildings, you often get amenities, gyms, coffee shops, and they tend to be pretty well located as well. I think it's nice in some cases that we actually start with a blank canvas. When buying off-plan or a brand new build property through a developer, you often get the opportunity to customize layouts, carpet colors, kitchen cabinets, other fittings. As well, I think that one thing that really shouldn't be overlooked, particularly in the context of the current situation, is things like warranties, incentives. Developers will occasionally add incentives. Net rental guarantees is one that's very common. And also we get things like 10-year warranties, NHBC or equivalent, that cover structural difficulties, any breakages. It can reduce repair costs considerably, and often some of the incentives that we've seen very, very recently are things like covering stamp duty or adding appliances at no extra cost. These things are great for you as a landlord because they dramatically increase the desirability of the property that you're buying. And then I think finally there's a lot to be said for the fact that new builds are clean, updated. Generally, they represent very, very easy investments for people who are looking for very passive levels of income. While a new home might not come with the same charm of a cottage, holiday let type property, it typically also doesn't come with the problems, which is the best way to look at new builds. There's much less need for maintenance, repair, costs of upkeep are down. So I suppose if I was to summarize that for you, very, very energy efficient, very, very modern, very desirable to particularly young renters. It's great that we can start with a blank canvas in terms of actually creating apartments or houses ourselves. There's some great warranties and incentives that mean that we got that little bit more peace of mind when we buy properties. And I think it's great that new builds are generally clean, well located, and modern in terms of their specification, which lends itself really, really well to an investment of 10 years plus into the long term. And so what about some of the drawbacks of new build property, or the cons, as you might say? Well, I think the first thing is a distinct lack of charm. I know a lot of buyers here in the United Kingdom love to have properties that carry with them a level of character. Many old houses are going to have unique features that new builds are just not going to have. Many developments are really designed to very modern standards, and they're in some ways designed to look as uniform as possible. Ultimately, it comes down to the preference of prospective tenants. Older tenants tend to like a little bit more character when they're renting. Younger tenants, young professionals, tend to prefer new build properties. I think there's been some comments recently about the build quality. And of course, while all new build properties will be built to the latest building and regulatory standards, there's often comments around things like thin walls. New houses often have plasterboard finishes. This might result in thin walls, sometimes thin floors. You may find yourself intervening in noise complaints. There's also regular complaints of inferior building materials, inferior finishes in some of the newer developments built in the UK. Again, we kind of we're able to overcome that by vetting the developers that we work with considerably. I think sometimes there's also a little bit of issue with what we call new build premium. New builds generally are more expensive to buy than what we call secondary market or older properties. New build houses, however, are generally cheaper to run. They command a new build premium course, because it's brand new, which can sometimes be anywhere between 5, 10, 15% higher than an equivalent property in terms of price per square foot in any given local area. A newly built one-bedroomed home in London, for example, costs about £130,000 more than something similarly sized in certain postcodes. I think what we've got to balance with new builds is the convenience and the attractiveness to tenants from a management perspective versus the additional cost that we're likely to outlay to purchase the property. And final thing, I think, with new builds, and this is sometimes more common of off-plan properties, is delays. So when we're purchasing off-plan, there is always a risk of a delay to the completion date of that property. Compliance issues, lack of materials, COVID outbreak is something that's been rather historic now, can delay completion of a project and subsequently the return on your investment. Generally, again, we try and do as much due diligence on any developers that we choose to work with as much as possible to minimize any risks that you have of those things. Poor quality finishes, more expensive to buy for you initially, and any risk of delays. Okay, so what are some of the pros of older built property or secondary market properties? Well, I think the first is probably what I'd call breathing room. Older houses are much more spacious, generally speaking, reflective of the amount of space that was available at the time in those areas, which can actually be a significant bonus in some cases for tenants. There's often things like parking spaces, bigger gardens, room sizes are generally bigger than you might find in a new build. And I think this is particularly desirable to slightly older tenants as well. I think a lot of people quite like to have character when renting. Period features appeal to many tenants. The character and history of different periods will appeal to some, make the home desirable to maybe particular types of renters. I think that's also very, very important if we're considering something like a holiday let. I think cottages, things like that are very attractive, very desirable. Things like period features add to the charm and add to the appeal of those investment opportunities. I think older properties as well tend to be located very, very well, closer to amenities, as an example. Older homes surrounded by well-established neighbours, public transport, pubs, restaurants, shops. These can be very appealing, of course, for families, schools as well, that want to become part of a community while renting. Generally better quality finishes. I know a lot of the rooms and things have thicker walls. Older properties tend to have brickwork, stone masonry, and the fixtures and finishes to older homes were typically more built to last than some modern properties are. And I think actually there's something to be said as well for development potential, dependent on your stomach for adding value to a property. You might sometimes say that refurbishment might go under cons as well, and no doubt I'll probably cover that in our cons section. Dependent on your investment goals, it can be a bonus. You can buy a fixer-upper, restore it, rent it, and later sell it on for considerably more than you might be able to do with a new build property. So there's some of the pros of buying an older property. Breathing room or more space, character, tend to be better locations, closer to amenities, thicker walls, generally better quality finishes than newer build properties, and I suppose just to sneak a fifth one in there, potential as well. So what about the cons, or what about the downsides of an older built property? I think the first thing to mention, and something that's very topical currently in 2022, an aged energy system. Older homes tend to have older heating systems, bigger spaces that can send utility bills skyrocketing. I know that there's a lot of regulation coming in at the moment around things like EPC ratings. There may need to be a lot of work done by a landlord to ensure that the property is EPC at least grade C, which is compliant from a rental property from 2028. Maintenance costs might be higher, damp, leaks, peeling wallpaper, rickety heating systems, as we've just mentioned. These things can appear much more frequently when we're buying or operating older properties for rent. You may look at things like outdated decor. In an old Georgian or Edwardian home, chances are tenants might love those features, but shag carpeting from the 80s, loud paisley from the 70s is not going to appeal to everybody, particularly not younger tenants. And then I think the final thing to say, and I actually covered this a little bit in our pros video, is refurbishment. You may not have the appetite nor the available funds to refurb an older property. Refurb, particularly when we have inflation here in the UK, costs can be very, very significant. As a result of that, it may cost you far more to make a property habitable than it would have cost you a number of years back. So I suppose the cons: aged energy systems, EPC ratings, maintenance costs, outdated decor, and the need for refurbishment.